Walt, it's becoming a trend here in autonomy markets. Another week, another big week for Waymo. There's news reports that Waymo has their supply. The question we'll find out later is Walt happy? Then we had earnings from Aurora, Lyft, and AV ride owner Nebius. And there's some news happening on the foreign autonomous we're going to dive into. But let's start with the big news. It looks like Waymo's got their supply of vehicles. Is Walt happy?
I don't know if supply and demand are going to quite be met because, as you know, I'm very bullish on the demand for safe, clean, reliable, and predictable rides from autonomy. But yes, Waymo got cars. There's a publication I've never heard of before called, I think you pronounce it Gasgoo. Hopefully they're reliable. No one's come out to really deny this, but apparently there's a deal in the works between Waymo and Hyundai to purchase 50,000 cars by 2028. So look, we already knew that they were getting cars from Hyundai. It was, in some of my expectations for the number of cars that Waymo was going to have in 2026. We didn't really expect them to hit, production, meaning, line fit production of these cars till the very end of the year, early 2027. So this was definitively a new data point and a lot of cars, 50,000 by 2028.
A lot of cars. And this week also, there's been multiple photos on X and Reddit of Waymo testing the Hyundais in San Francisco. So that's a really good positive sign. What I'd love to see us get clarity on, are they going to be line fit? Are they going to go to Magna? Are there going to be sensors? Are they going to basically get shells? I'd love to get an official release from Waymo of how these vehicles are going to start coming off, and eventually will they be fully factory produced and being able to go into service minutes after coming off the line?
A lot of great questions that popped into my mind as soon as I saw this story. I still don't think that you're going to see many out of them in 26. I think this 50,000 is mostly going to hit in 27 and 28. I mean, for Waymo, I'm only expecting about 4,000 new cars for them to receive for this year. And again, only a portion of that to be the Hyundai, the rest being Zeekr, and I think some residual volumes from Jag. And just look, to put this 50,000 in context, I had been forecasting for the entire industry in the United States, the entire autonomous industry, that by the end of 2028, there'd only be 55,000 cars total at the end of 28. And some of our peers on the street, I think, were even lower than that. And by the way, my estimate assumes very little from Tesla. That's something I'm holding back on until I see how Austin starts to scale. That's obviously going to be the turning point for Tesla. So that 50,000 alone, from Hyundai is a big number relative to street expectations.
I'll summarize it this way. Once we get official confirmation, probably in the form of a blog post from Waymo, I'll declare that Waymo just threw the gauntlet down on the industry. That 50,000 is a big number. The next domino to fall to further strengthen their thing is expand on that Toyota relationship. Now Waymo's cooking with a full tank of gas, or they're electric, so a full charge.
Cooking with ions. There were some financial data in there as well. They talked about a $2.5 billion deal for these 50,000 cars. Simple math would indicate that's $50,000 per car. I'm guessing that's just what they're paying Hyundai, and that wouldn't include the cost of their sensors. What do you think?
What we do know, Waymo has been actively working to reduce the cost of their sensors and compute. And if you look at, you and I were to go buy a Hyundai Ioniq 5 on the lot today with incentives, you could probably get one around 32 to 38,000. So based on that, there's a very good indicator that the sensors are built into that. Again, we have no confirmation, but based on the retail pricing, there's a very good confirmation because you have a plus or minus $20,000 buffer.
I mean, if that's the case, then what we're talking about here is more likely a line fit situation where the sensors are the sensor kit effectively purchased by Hyundai, integrated into the car and embedded into that $50,000 cost. Again, no idea. That would be certainly an interesting detail. And at that price point, I mean, I've run enough models to know that for all those that were questioning the ability to drive a profitable business, if you're talking 50,000 a car with the sensors, obviously if it's line fit, you don't even have to deal with that Mesa plant and incremental cost there. That's a great, I think, number for Waymo to exploit.
And what Waymo did, there's a certain faction of retail investors that said Waymo can never get it sub 100,000. They just blew that narrative up overnight.
Well, look, I mean, that's the type of stuff that I heard in Starlink. They're never going to get their CPE down below $1,000. I don't, you follow technology for enough decades, you know how prices come down as obviously that you scale up. And 50,000, great number. Still, we're going to see materially larger scale over the years. So these are numbers that I think can probably continue to drop. But again, no confirmation of that. For all we know, the 50,000 does not include the sensor stack. A little more context there. Our friends at Nuro, I think their sensor stack is probably $10,000, maybe $15,000 from what I understand. I mean, I think, this is the kind of incremental cost, the ballpark that people should think about if they're trying to question whether autonomy can challenge the economics of the human-driven rideshare market.
Another thing that needs to be looked at, if you look at multiple analysts and banks that publish this data, what's the cost of LiDAR now? 98, 99% since the early days when David Hall founded Velodyne. So you and I know, and you know from your experience, this cost technology starts here, goes, and it goes down, eventually gets commoditized.
Well, that wasn't the only news from Waymo this week, Grayson, as it relates to this topic that we've been, maybe more so me than you, but I think both of us have been focused on volumes. Waymo had a post on their website. I guess you would call it a blog post, an update, really just announcing sixth generation. There was a lot of stuff in there that we'll get into, but let me first focus on what stood out to me immediately. Tens of thousands of cars are going to go through that Mesa plant. Again, so this is implying upfit. This is different than I think what we believe is the case with Hyundai. Tens of thousands of cars is what they're ramping to. So in my mind, this is probably the Zeekr. Zeekr, which is now they're calling Ohai, spelled with I think a J. These are Chinese vehicles, so I think there are some restrictions by commerce and about tidying, vehicle supply chain and not allowing some of this U.S. technology to be installed there. So these are going to be purchased, by Waymo, taken to that plant, upfitted with these sensors. But to get to tens of thousands of vehicles incrementally now with Zeekr, again, just adds to this addressing the supply questions that we and I think many have had in terms of Waymo.
I mean, I'll use a simple, silly term. Waymo's open for business. It's very clear that Waymo is focused on scaling. I still do feel that the Zeekr, it's not the Ohai, it's the Zeekr rebranded, was still an unforced error, but I really love the bullishness coming out of Waymo. And the unsung hero that's really enabled Waymo to scale over the years, in my opinion, doesn't get enough credit is Magna. Magna is one of the world's best contract manufacturers, one of the world's best upfitters. And the work that they've done on the JLR Jaguar I-Paces has been absolutely incredible. So no matter which way Waymo goes, if all factory, I'd love to see some sort of relationship with Magna continue because the engineering that Magna's done has been top notch.
So there's no timeline on either of these things. Right. So tens of thousands. I don't think your Zeekr is going to hit tens of thousands in 26. Like I said before, I don't think Hyundai, those 50,000, I think a very small percentage of that will hit in 26. With that said, with these two announcements, do I need to rethink my expectation for Waymo? Right now, I think I have them adding 3,500 cars in 26, more than doubling the number of cars they ended 2025, which was, I think, about 2,500. Do you think I need to rethink that and take that number higher, Grayson?
I do. Based on the announcements, I do. But I will say that with the caveat, you could get some executive order from the Trump administration that effectively bans the Ohai. That could affect your numbers. But the way it's currently written, I would consider putting your number to 4,200 to 4,500.
We'll say. I'm not willing to do it yet. I want to start seeing those Ohais actually turned on with customers, which has not yet happened, right? We see them, plenty of videos and pictures of them on the road, but it hasn't really been turned on. But like Tesla, you need that kind of hit that step before you start to scale up the sensor installment.
The Ohais, we did get an announcement, I believe it was Next Post, that they are testing them with employees and trusted friends. If you want to use the term trusted friends, I don't know the proper term to use that Waymo has invited to go in the vehicles. The other thing that we need to watch for with the Zeekrs will not be deployed in every public market that Waymo has. I believe, based on the political narratives around the country, the Zeekrs will be placed in more left-leaning states than right-wing states because of the China issue. So that's something to watch there. I'll give you an example. If you look at the official announcement that Waymo made for announcing the Denver market, it was announced specific language and photograph of the Zeekr. Does Denver become a Zeekr-only market? do we start to see that evolve? That's something to watch as well.
I said before in my coverage of the wireless industry in the early days, pre-EBITDA, pre-revenue, even to a certain extent, the early signs on things like units give you greater confidence in your longer term estimates. So for example, like if I went back to 95 and I tried to forecast what I thought the number of phones that people would have in their hands 10 years, I way undershot it. Right. And it turned out being much bigger, and some of that came to realization as they started to roll out. So let's turn back to these car levels. Again, going 55 was my estimate for end of 28. Clearly, Waymo alone is going to top that number. If you just kind of model it out, getting to 750,000 cars in less than a decade doesn't seem like heavy lifting. And if you think about 750,000 cars in the US, which the context is rideshare companies, Uber, Lyft, you're talking about a 2.2 million-ish range of drivers, obviously aren't on the road all day. So that 750 equates 2 to 3 times that size based on their availability. Now there's peak hour things that have to be addressed, but I mean, that is a substantial number of cars that could probably take, half the rideshare market in terms of miles driven. Half. Right now, look, the rideshare market, as bulls have pitched, could expand dramatically. So it's less than that in a much larger market, but this is all happening in less than a decade. And I just want to underscore, sorry to pick on it, but in the last couple of weeks and months, you've had Darren and David Risher out there saying that they couldn't scale, the autonomous industry couldn't scale for decades, plural, decades. And, I think the trajectory that they're on right now is they can get to decent scale that takes a substantial portion of a reasonable expectation of the market in less than 10 years.
You're seeing, and this is just me, I believe you're seeing a massive disconnect in the market between myth and reality. And then when I say that, you're seeing Waymo scale at a pretty incredible pace. You have Toyota lurking over here, which everybody knows can scale faster than any company in the world when it comes to scaling vehicles. And to say that this technology is going to be delayed, it's not. I'll give you a wireless analogy. I'm going to go way back in wireless world with you. I don't know why I'm going there, but I'm going there. I remember OmniPoint way back in the day with OmniPoint in the GSM. And there was a CDMA that Verizon had. Oh, they can never scale GSM. It's a European thing. And you know this better than I do. I was just a customer. Boy, oh boy, did that OmniPoint GSM network in America scale faster than I think anybody really imagined. The same thing is going to happen with autonomy. It's not just Waymo. That Lucid vehicle, they have the capability to produce thousands of those vehicles at the plant in Arizona. And when these vehicles come online, despite what the market thinks and what certain individuals on certain podcasts think, autonomy is going to disrupt the traditional rideshare market. It's not necessarily going to expand the pie. It's going to really disrupt it. And I think it is an existential threat to the traditional rideshare business.
So as our listeners can see, we can barely contain our enthusiasm that we got this news out of Waymo. Hopefully both of the things we're reading properly. There was one small disappointment in this context of what came out of Waymo this week. The language in there made it pretty clear to me that Waymo has no intention to make their own car. I forget the exact quote. I think I tweeted it. If you can look at my Twitter account for the exact quote. So my hopes for maybe Waymo going to a contract manufacturer and making their own car is dashed. So I think what's next for Waymo is getting an OEM, and I can already hear the criticism. Well, they just got 50,000 and they just got Zeekr. I hear you. But, starting a process with a new OEM now is not going to yield cars, obviously, for at least 18 months, right? 2 years, maybe, especially if you're looking for low cost line fit type implementations with Western manufacturers. I don't think we want to keep relying on this Mesa plant in Phoenix when you really want to hit the scale that's going to get you the 750,000 cars that I'm expecting in less than a decade, much less than a decade. So that's what I'm hopeful. I'm disappointed that they won't just make it. That's fine. Let's get another OEM on the tape. They had that Toyota announcement that you referenced earlier. Nothing there that has come of it as of yet, but there's plenty of other OEMs that maybe are starting to feel incremental pressure that, hey, they gotta start thinking about autonomy, even though EV was a kind of a bust for them, that autonomy could be their future.
It is going to be their future. I will say, I know it's discontinued, but I was a fan of the Firefly car. You can go visit it at the Computer History Museum in Silicon Valley. It's really, really cool, really great design. But it was the right decision to move away from it. As Casper, the CEO of Applied, says, building and running a car company is a hard thing to do, and that's not what Alphabet's strengths are. And Casper's right. He was there for many years before starting Applied. So I like that. If you look at the global automotive business, you have two companies that come to mind, both Japanese, that I believe that could make moves. One, you have Honda. They were a former investor in Cruise. They like the space. They currently have in a relationship with Helmet AI that Vlad is running. But so Honda could very much be in play. And the other that needs to make it a strategic move, Nissan. Yes, Nissan has the relationship with Wave for the Pro Pilot 2. That's an L2 system. However, Nissan does have excess capacity in certain Japanese plants to start ramping up autonomous vehicles. And why do I say Nissan, Walt? There's been reports over the last couple months coming out of Nikkei out of Tokyo that Nissan was looking to sublease those plants and or sell those plants to Foxconn to build frames for autonomous vehicles. So where there's smoke, there's fire.
Grayson loves to cite the Nikkei. I've had mixed mixed success with some of their information in the past. Now those are great ideas, OEMs, but Grayson, I'm going to take it a step further and say, look, if Uber's out there and others are saying, the bull case is that this dramatically expands the rideshare market because it's lowering cost, expand the market. That's the mantra, right? Whether it's short term or long term. If you're expanding miles driven rideshare, dropping the cost, like that is potentially taking away from private car sales, right? Reducing the fact that second or third car in your garage is going to happen because you'll just use rideshare instead. Otherwise, how does that whole concept of rideshare market expanding? If you're whiteboarding this at the OEMs, and I know there's OEMs that listen to this, like you have to consider that. That is another pressure point. It's not about just doing a Waymo deal to sell cars into the Waymo rideshare market, which will represent like if, the X million cars a year, X, Y% are going to be autonomous. It's also selling to the end customers, selling cars in the future, having, some type of autonomy included, even if it's only available on a regional basis, is going to be necessary for you to drive revenue just from your base product. Do you agree or not?
Yes, because I'll cite the data to Cox Automotive and to Experian here. You are seeing a trend in the United States. I've not looked at international data, so I want to cite this. This is based on U.S. data. You are seeing consumers, U.S. households, move from 3 vehicles, 2 vehicles to 1 vehicle. You're seeing them downsize as a way to cut expenses. It is a very real growing trend.
Now let's move on to the more meat of the Waymo post, which was not the supply stuff that excites the two of us. There was a lot of discussed about the sensors that are on these Waymos. What were your takeaways from that part of the Waymo post?
The sensors were interesting. Reading between the lines, Waymo talked a lot about the camera upgrading to a 17 megapixel camera, saying they could do more with less because of the high fidelity on that. That had a very interesting undertone to the way it was written. Did you pick up on that?
No, I didn't. What did you say?
The way it was written, basically, and this is my opinion, they were taking a shot at Tesla and saying that their cameras are superior to the Tesla cameras.
I mean, that's possible. I think there were more obvious shots at Tesla. I mean, there was whole sections on how they have camera cleaners, and as our listeners know, and those that are following it closely, some of the cars in Austin have been spotted with cleaners on cameras that don't exist on my Tesla Model Y, right? So maybe that was a shot there. And obviously there was, once again, a full section on LiDAR. And then there was a tweet later by someone from Tesla, I think on the engineering side, talking about how this blog post or this post by Waymo was talking about how you want to get multiple data points or multiple sensor inputs to make your autonomy work, which is obviously the opposite of what the Tesla mantra has been, is where some of these multiple data points can confuse and slow down the reaction. So yeah, I think I didn't pick up on the megapixel camera one, but I did pick up that kind of undertone on the cleaners, the camera cleaners, and also the LiDAR section about it.
I'll summarize it this way. The blog post was very crafty in terms of the language that we use. And it wasn't just sensors, there was also language around compute, where this is, I'm going to quote this here: Waymo's custom silicon chips rather than relying on multiple hardware components. That language was in there. That's interesting. Not one mention of NVIDIA. Custom silicon chips. Interesting.
I mean, look, this is their thing, custom, right? Custom LiDAR as well. Obviously, they've claimed in this very podcast, in this very blog post, that they have, even though their LiDAR is custom, that they've benefited from the drop in industry prices. I think some of the criticism has been like, oh, LiDAR is so cheap, if you should have just bought a third party. They're claiming that they've benefited from those, the reduced cost on the LiDAR. And then NVIDIA stuff is like, obviously, the counterpoint here is from Uber saying that the NVIDIA system is going to effectively democratize and commoditize autonomy. So I think it was interesting for them to push their own custom silicon chips. Look, Google gets a lot of props given how they've turned around Gemini relative to the early threats of ChatGPT. So I think you got to cut them some slack and some benefit here about what they can do on the custom silicon side of things.
Well, that's an incredible custom silicon shop. I play with the TPUs, Walt, for training purposes of data. The TPUs are phenomenal. I mean, the engineering that went into the TPUs is great. The other thing, I'm going to put on my Walt hat here, when you're building custom silicon, the costs go down. You're not reliant on if you want to call it the NVIDIA tax. Their costs go down. So everybody looks at, the cost for the compute, the cost for this. I'm going to go on here and make a prediction. I think Waymo's cost to build and operate the Waymo vehicle today are a lot less than the market thinks.
I mean, sure, but you're just ignoring the billions that they've spent over the past decade to get to this point to custom build everything. But sure, maybe it's cheaper to go. Look, with all this tech, Grayson, I want to understand they can do the custom chips, they can clean the cameras, they can get the 50 million megapixel whatever, but they can't get a door that closes. They're now paying DoorDash to close the doors for them in the market. What's going on with that?
As much as I don't want to admit it, no, I don't like it. That's why they went to the Zeekr design, so the doors can remotely close. The way that, and you and I, when we were in Austin, we tested this. If you walk away, the vehicle can't go through the door open. So that they had to solve the door problem. So over time, I'm not going to give a prediction of when, because I don't have any insight or any idea. But at some point, those Jaguar vehicles are all going to be discontinued, and so they're going to go to models where the doors can close.
Well, I would hope if you're spending $2.5 billion with Hyundai, that Hyundai can figure out how to put some type of motor mechanism in there to close the door, and perhaps a much larger reservoir for your camera cleaning fluids as well that is going to be needed. Some of those custom autonomy changes that are going to need to happen for some of these cars.
But that's the fun thing about this podcast. You and I talk about all the nuances, or you're going to call it the nooks and crannies that go into operating this, from cameras to cleaning to fleet management. We go through it all, and I think we do a pretty good job.
Now, with all this Waymo news, we talked about Uber's earnings last week, myths and realities, but they were out there again. There was some podcasts and stuff, and really talking up the partners. So I think it's good to kind of like go through, some of the partners that they're talking about, saying like, okay, Waymo's out there and they're great, but we've got, WeRide and AV Ride and Pony, and saying that, like they're all there. I mean, just for context, again, like today, Waymo has 2,500 plus cars, right? We think it's about 1,000 square miles of service area. Pony, which was, I think, brought up, has 1,000 cars. So, 1,000 to 2,500. I think based on what I was able to see online in China, you're talking about 1,600 square miles. Now, Waymo already gets complaints, primarily pushed by Uber themselves, about the wait times for a Waymo versus, a human driver. So how is it working with Pony with 1,000 cars and 1,600 square miles versus Waymo's 2,500 cars with 1,000 square miles? Like, do we have more qualitative feedback on how that service is going? And I think Pony's talked about going to 3,000 cars at year end. And I think by my estimates that Waymo is going to be more than twice that in this market.
I'll use the term that this audience is familiar with. It's behind the Great Firewall. What's truly happening behind the Great Firewall, we don't know. We did get some insight this week. There was an article published in Insider. Brian Walker-Smith, who's a professor University of South Carolina, went to the mainland to ride in vehicles. Well, the article was sparse on details. A couple interesting things. You had to be, and this is quoted in the article here, you have to be a Chinese resident to download the app to get in there. There's a lot of restrictions of who can go in those vehicles. Not everybody can go in those vehicles. Another interesting thing from the article is that you're limited to the geofence, and they're smaller than the Western media thinks they are. They only operate at certain times of the day. The government could say, which I believe this one, okay, you're shut down, too much traffic, you can't operate now. So when you get down to the nitty gritty, or I'll use the term the ground truth, I don't think it's as impressive as the market believes it is to be, because when you're getting this ground truth intelligence, it's a little different than what the market's interpreting.
Well, I don't know if it's the market. I think what we're specifically talking about is what Uber's pushing in their defensiveness about the Waymo progress, about where Pony is. And I think they've listed May Mobility. We're familiar with where May Mobility's coverage is in the markets. We've obviously been in those cars. We ride another Chinese maker, 1,000 cars. AV Ride, which I think is 80 cars, is what they disclosed on their earnings report. Again, versus the 2,500 going to 6,000, going to tens of thousands a year, which is Waymo. The other thing that I think to me is curious is, you're out there like basically knocking down Waymo to a certain extent and pumping up Chinese car makers, and you're a U.S. company. And at some point, there is some sensitivity about the race to AI, which is like the race to 5G. And if you're a U.S. company, I mean, they constricted NVIDIA's ability to, at least to a certain extent, no longer to sell chips. Like, you have a U.S. company basically, helping and promoting and partnering with these Chinese car manufacturers, while at the same time, like, showing them in comparison to a great U.S. company in Waymo and Google.
I would summarize what you said this way. It's an unforced error, and frankly, it's unfortunate. Where it goes, I don't know, but I do think that you will see geopolitical risks emerge both in the UK, the EU, in the US around this technology of Uber accelerating the adoption of Chinese autonomy. But then Waymo's not in the clear either. They have the Zeekr. So both parties have their own political risks based on strategy decisions they've made.
So let's transition to, again, the third leg of the stool that I've talked about, the servicing of the cars. Again, in Uber's defense, in many of these interviews, it made it sound like they're, the part to scaling autonomy would be like, who's going to, deal with all the software to figure out where the car should go or how many they should have or clean them. And it almost made it sound like Uber owns the cleaning function. As our listeners well know, these are all third parties, right? And there's incremental expense when you're going through an Avoma or Move or whoever it is as a third party. That's very different than Lyft. And Lyft actually highlighted this on their earnings call, saying that FlexDrive, by having it in-house and focusing on this, will provide 20% of incremental savings. Now, we're not saying like if it costs $1 per mile or whatever it is for a human, 80 cents for autonomy, it doesn't take it down to 60 cents, right? It's 20% of the 20%. Like, so it is small, but in a business where, you're talking about bookings or EBITDA being a single digit margin on a bookings number, those little things matter. And I think this investment that Lyft is making in FlexDrive is very different than what Uber is doing in terms of third parties. And I tend to agree that if executed properly, it can be a strategic advantage and one that delivers greater margins. It's just funny or interesting that it almost seems like Uber's trying to leave people with the impression that they're actually doing this. They're not. Like, these are third party partners, and in some cases, I think from your video last week in Miami, one of their partners is servicing the Waymos in Miami, and that's not going to be an Uber partner for Waymo in Miami.
You're correct about that. That partner for Waymo in Miami is Move, and Move has an investor in Uber, and they're also partners. So a lot of interesting things going there, but I want to highlight the FlexDrive part. FlexDrive to me is a strategic asset for Lyft. Jeremy Bird this week was on the Autonomy podcast, and I asked Jeremy, I said, could we ever see a scenario where Lyft perhaps does a partnership with Waymo or another AV company where they only use FlexDrive? And his exact words, you can listen to it on the Road to Autonomy podcast, possibly. That's interesting. That could become a business, quite a business for Lyft if they wanted to accelerate that, because nobody's cornered the fleet management market yet. Move is trying their best, but it's still an open market.
Well, the market's tiny, right? So there's nothing to corner yet, but as it grows, they can be there. And look, I've said this before for our longtime listeners. If you argue that like charging and servicing cars is a low margin business, like what do you think autonomy is? Like, if you look at the margins on the bookings, this is a single digit margin business, right? I mean, it's not, you're not, the revenue is like after the take rate. So, and again, an important component. The downside is like, look, FlexDrive isn't traditionally doing this. They're going to have to learn new skill sets. They're literally just breaking ground in Nashville now. So we're not going to really know until later this year. And frankly, in terms of Lyft's relationship with Waymo, like it's going to take, I think, until 2027 for Lyft to prove out why that model that they're doing with Waymo, which is not only servicing with FlexDrive, but also sharing the Waymo fleet, right? Not having a separate, like the way Phoenix works. Waymo has cars that go onto the Uber platform. They have cars that go into the Waymo One. In Nashville, it's just one set of Waymo cars that go into the Lyft platform as well as the Waymo One platform. Again, we're not going to know probably till later this year. So best case, maybe end of the year, early 27, you have an opportunity for Lyft to expand that. But again, it's a model that we agree with. We just hope that Lyft can execute and do it quickly.
Just when you thought it was safe to move away from the Waymo blog post, I had to put my inspector hat on, but it's not my hat today. It's your hat. You WhatsApp me. Hey, you're never going to believe this. Look at what I posted on X. You saw a graphic inside of the animation. What did you see, Inspector Walt?
I have to hat tip you as well. You can put your clappy hat on. That you actually hit me and say, did you see the truck graphic in the Waymo post? And I'm like, brother, you have not been watching my Twitter account because I posted that picture like half an hour ago. So you also had your inspector hat on. And basically it was the section in the Waymo post where they were talking about how like the Waymo driver is applicable to any number of cars, and they're flashing through different cars. And one of them was a Class A truck. So, people that know this industry know that they've had trucking before. I think they already have an OEM partner in Daimler. I don't even know if that's been terminated, but wow, that was interesting. Do you think we're reading too much into this?
I'm reading in that I like you being an inspector, so I put the clap hat on to give you a proper clap. Listen, as I said earlier, that post, the blog post from Waymo, was extremely well crafted. And I'll say it this way. That graphic inside of that animation was not put there by accident. And to me, it's even more strategically interesting. We know, based on public filings, that Daimler Truck is going to release the dual redundant Cascadia in 2027. We also know that prior to shutting down Waymo Via, Waymo had a public partnership with Daimler. Why is that important? Because the chassis to scale becomes available to the public in 2027. So there's perhaps a little bit of interesting timing in that post.
Could be. I mean, look, earlier this week we had one of their effectively competitors in this space, Aurora, do a bit of a pivot after they had some issues with PACCAR, who was a OEM partner, are now going to be upfitting international trucks. This is International is an actual partner, an integrated partner with Plus AI. So, I guess Waymo can theoretically do what Kodiak has done and then what Aurora has effectively copied, literally with the same upfitter in Roush, by just buy trucks and then upfit them with the Waymo. I mean, that's what they're doing in Phoenix now with the Jaguars and I guess with the Zeekrs. And, maybe they don't have the same type of volume demands that that the cars have. Like, to put it in context, Aurora's talking about doing, I think they say about 20 trucks a week that they're going to purchase from International, and then they're going to upfit again with Roush, which is the same upfitter that Kodiak is using for their trucks.
So if they're purchasing them from International, do they just go into the local International dealer and buy them, or any insight to how that relationship looks?
No, I think they're buying them directly from corporate. I don't think they're buying them from a dealer. So it's not, you could argue like, if it's through corporate, why aren't they having the same restriction that PACCAR had? Meaning that PACCAR forced Aurora to have that person sitting at the driver's wheel. I guess a different type of integration. Obviously, they're not using any proprietary parts. So it's look, there was an international person at the Plus AI Investor Day and talking about how, they can't really, it's challenging maybe to have multiple integrated partners. So, but I'm sure it sounds like they're fine with just selling. I mean, they'll sell whatever it is, 100 or 200 cars this year. Even if Aurora then transitions to line fitting using, I think what's Continental and maybe either Volvo or maybe PACCAR finally gets on board, that they're going to continue to upfit international trucks, again, 20 a week. They've got big aspirations. They at their investor day back in 24, they talked about $1.4 billion target, I think, of revenue in 2028, and they're exiting at what, an 80 million run rate. So there's a lot of ground between an 80 million run rate, which is their target for this year, and $1.4 billion in 2028. So they're going to need to get a lot of these trucks on the road. So it is going to progress towards integration. But at least for this year, it's basically doing the Kodiak, copying the Kodiak approach of upfitting. Again, we went down this thought process, like, why couldn't Waymo do the same thing and just buy some trucks and upfit them with the Waymo driver?
Waymo can, and it just, as you said, it just validates what Don Burnett and Kodiak's strategy was at the end of the day with upfitting. Because if I was playing a drinking game listening to the Aurora call, partner requested driver observer, I'd be hammered by the time the call was over. And if you look at the restrictions that PACCAR placed on Aurora, it had a lot of impact on them. And if you look at buying what they're doing now with internationals, you clearly heard on the earnings call, there's not those restrictions there. So there is nothing to stop Waymo from doing it. The only thing is infrastructure, because Waymo, I mean, they can go get the real estate. They have a great real estate team. They don't have any of the old real estate left from Via. That was all acquired by Wabi, believe it or not, the Texas facility. So they'd have to go start getting real estate.
There's clearly more to this trucking business than just buying a truck. And I mean, you got to actually sell it. You have to, create the areas where you drop it off. No matter what you say, the truck is different in terms of its size and where it's driving. So, it's interesting. I think we wouldn't go over the top in terms of the impact to Aurora, but it was just something, since we have done trucking here and we have talked about Aurora and Kodiak, something to shout out. By the way, Aurora, that's not the only thing they had to say. They talked about how they've now kind of solved, I guess, rain, fog, heavy wind, driving at nights, and they expanded their lanes. They added 7 lanes, over the quarter to quarter. Now, I didn't see 7 new markets, so I've had to educate myself on what a trucking lane is. Now I think you've gone to Forward Fort Worth more than me. Why don't you describe to me what you think a lane is, and I will tell you the reality, or tell you if you're right or wrong.
I'm not Lee White and I'm not Jim Mullen, so I'll give you my best humble opinion of a lane. The most obvious, most well-known lane in the autonomous trucking world, Dallas to Houston. So I view that as a lane.
Right. So what's interesting here is I'm gonna express it in East Coast terms, not Dallas terms. Let's assume that New York to Philly is a lane, right? And then we assume, and by the way, there's 2 because it's both ways. So New York to Philly is 1 lane, Philly to New York is another lane. So there's 2. Now let's say Philly to DC, there's 1 lane. DC to Philly, there's another lane. Now we're up to 4. So it turns out that if you went from New York to DC, that's another lane. That is another new lane. And then back again is a 6th lane. So 5 and 6. So even though the actual roads that you're on are 95% the same, maybe 98% the same, you're just passing by when you're going from New York, down to DC, you're passing by Philly. That is counted as another lane. So I learned something new. Apparently, this is like the industry standard. Maybe our friends over at JB Hunt and others can affirm that, yay or nay, whether that's true. But it gave me a better, idea in how these things are going to scale. At the end of the day, though, for Aurora, it's going to be getting those 200 trucks, signing up revenue-generating customers, and starting to ramp that revenue. to reduce that cash burn.
And the other thing for Aurora, which I believe the technology is ready, is removing the observer. They remove the observer and they start running those hundreds and thousands of miles consistently back and forth 24/7. Then things start to get really interesting. And then I do believe you start to see autonomy accelerate, because then at that point here in the United States, you will have two companies operating commercial driverless trucks with no human in the cabs, Kodiak and Aurora. And that's a really good sign for the industry.
I mean, but that is the case. The 200 trucks that they expect this year, again, these are the upfit international trucks, are not going to have a driver in there. So, and obviously if they do, like, that's the whole point. Like that is what we're trying to get to. Was there more? Was there other trucking? What did Kodiak have to say in response to all of this week?
Kodiak announced a partnership with the United States Marine Corps. Kodiak announced a partnership on the United States Marine Corps where they're going to adopt their technology to the Rogues platform. Pretty good there. Their defense business is booming. If you see public statements and press releases out of the Department of War, the budget for the Department of War is getting big, and a lot of that's going in technology. So this could be a very interesting catalyst for Kodiak as they expand their defense business.
There's also just got to be so much validation for Don Burnett, the CEO, because there was some level of attacks about, upfitting versus partnerships and how important partnerships are. And here they are. And, Aurora, who many have pushed this concept as the leader in the space, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, is upfitting, right? With literally the same upfitter that Kodiak is. But anyway, let's move to the foreign autonomy desk. And I think let's start with Lyft. What news do we have from Lyft on the foreign autonomy desk, Grayson?
We're going to one of the world's great cities, London. Lyft and Jeremy Bird, not to talk about the Road to Autonomy podcast, discussed this in great detail. This year on Lyft will be launching the Baidu RT6 robotaxis in London. We do not know if it can be in Westminster, City of London. We don't know where in London proper, but we do know that they will be launching this year and pending regulatory updates. Now, this gets interesting on the regulatory front because the UK government, despite the if you want to call it the upheaval in the Prime Minister's office, is moving the timeline up to deploy commercial driver-out robotaxis in London. Originally, it's going to be Q4. Signs are pointing it could be Q2, Q3. The UK government is starting to get very bullish on this technology, so good sign for Lyft there.
I mean, and Baidu is a company that is obviously of interest. I mean, I think they also had an announcement this week of that the robotaxi service is going to be launching on, Uber this month in Dubai. Obviously, Dubai and I think has multiple autonomy opportunities there. But just like Abu Dhabi, there's going to be a dedicated AV tier in the Uber app. So look, and obviously Uber doesn't own third party. We know the third party person there, New Horizon. So again, that's how the Uber model works, whether it's US or overseas. So Baidu, definitely obviously one of the leaders to watch in this space.
And the other thing that we learned on that release, they're going to be launching in the Jumeirah area, a high concentration of tourist areas on the Gulf, so really good strategic position to launch. Because if you know the geography of Dubai, it's very separated, so very good going area there, because it goes into my whole theory, tourism based on this launch in the Jumeirah area. It is clearly based on tourism, but I don't want to poke the bear or needle, but why in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, can you get a dedicated autonomous vehicle tier, but you can't get one in other markets?
That's a good question. Maybe it's supply. I don't know. I mean, if you're getting Baidu, maybe they're able to supply many more cars than Waymo is in those partnerships, and that could be it. But I think in Uber, the other partner that they have, I believe, is WeRide, who just launched commercial service in Abu Dhabi. Does that also go into its own tier in Uber, as far as you know?
Now, this gets interesting. In the official Uber press release, no mention of dedicated tier. In the official WeRide release, mention of dedicated tier. Interesting there. Another good point to point out, the vehicles will be operating in downtown Abu Dhabi, and they've also publicly announced that they're operating on Yas Island, which is where the Warner Brothers, the Ferrari World, all the entertainment is, and most of the really good hotels are downtown by the mosque and the UAE president's residence. So really good geographic region. Again, why do I bring that up? That's where majority of the tourists in Abu Dhabi spend their time. So these are being strategically deployed in those locations.
The president's residents. That's pretty good alliteration there, Grayson. Well done on that. So that was a good foreign autonomy desk. We also have a regulatory desk. Didn't we have a special name that we were going to use for the regulatory desk? Have I already forgotten? I thought we had a good name for that, or maybe that was something else. But in any event, Wired magazine, yes, they still exist, is talking about asking residents of DC to pressure officials. I loved seeing this because this is exactly what I think is ultimately going to happen to our poor friends up in Boston who have the Teamsters and the mayor and everyone else, I guess, against bringing autonomy to Boston. It's, at some point you're going to have to, the citizens are going to see what's going on around the rest of the country and the world and demand it. And I don't know. I kind of like the fact that Waymo is trying to drum up that support. What do you think about that policy strategy, Grayson?
Waymo's getting aggressive, and I like it. And they're not taking no for an answer. And I like it. Is it going to work? I don't know. I'll say that I hope it works. And I will say this for the record. I think that autonomous vehicles for Washington, D.C. are great. And going back for the third time's a charm, they're great for tourism. If you want to go visit the Washington Monument and you want to go have dinner in Georgetown, what's a better way to connect you than in a Waymo? It's a really great experience. I could see a business being built where you can go see the sights and sounds of DC in a Waymo. Great opportunity. DC is a great district, if you want to call it that, the true name, but it is a city district. Really good. And I hope Waymo is successful because the special interest shouldn't stand in the way of progress.
Clearly not the administration that's the problem in DC in this scenario. It's the local officials, but that's a good segue to what we heard out of NHTSA this week, which they've scheduled a meeting on March 10th to basically provide updates on the ongoing automation activity across NHTSA. They're going to feature keynote addresses from DOT leadership, panel discussions on automated driving systems. And I guess this dates back to some meeting that they did in November where they got some initial information. So it feels like the drumbeat for, some type of national framework continue to beat on there.
It's a positive sign. Mr. Morrison, the NHTSA administrator, will be giving remarks. There will be a workshop that is open to the public. You can register on the NHTSA website or the Federal Register to go and attend and voice your opinion about this technology. You are right. We are starting to see positive momentum from a regulatory standpoint towards autonomy. And me putting on my policy hat, do you know how the autonomous vehicle industry wins this? You make it United States versus China, and you will have bipartisan support on that. And that's how you ultimately get this across the finish line.
I like it. So we have a couple cleanup items. I shouldn't call them cleanup items, but just to make sure that we cover the diversity of autonomy. Nebius, who's the owner of AV Ride. We already talked about the fact that they've disclosed having 80 cars in the market. That's impressive by AV Ride. As you know, that we have our own video of AV Ride. Check it out. It's one of our most watched videos on Autonomy Markets of what that experience was like. So we hope to get it down there and test it in a commercial scenario as well. They also have the robot delivery business. We also have video of that and those robots, and they're very smart robots. But they disclosed that they surpassed 316,000 deliveries, not robots, deliveries in 2025. And in Q4, the robots delivered 3 times as many deliveries per day versus Q3. That's so a tripling sequentially. That's pretty solid. Obviously we've talked about Serve Robotics and them hitting milestones. It's funny, like someone was, there was a podcast that someone did with Uber, and they were saying, oh yeah, you have this great, oh my God, why am I blanking on the name of it? Sorry.
Neuro.
So there was a podcast this week. They were talking about the Neuro relationship. We love the Neuro team also scaling those Lucids, which is a car that I love. Great. But they're like, oh yeah. And what about like Uber Eats and the Uber robot? Like, yeah, no, that business is not happening. Just because it didn't work for Neuro, I think they were before their time because it's on-road delivery. Doesn't mean it's not happening for AV Ride, for Serve Robotics, for Coco, I think is in this space as well. It's one of those spaces that's kind of on the side, but like it's also an important element of autonomy.
It's a very important element. When I was down in Miami quite a bit testing out the Waymo stuff, I could tell you the Serve Robotics and the Coco Robotics are everywhere. And They're really good. They're good. They serve a purpose, and they have a market wind at their back because I truly believe, and there is data to back this up, that consumers are tip fatigued. They're tired of tipping. You don't tip the robot. So I think that's going to be a propellant and a really good win for those companies. While there's the wind at the back, Walt, of the autonomous robot delivery companies, a company from the past, they're back. I can give you that. Here's Johnny, but here's Motional. Brad Templeton put up a piece on Forbes that announced that Motional is now testing driver out with safety attended, very similar to Tesla in the original days, in the passenger seat. So they're on their way coming back, testing in Las Vegas. They're owned by Hyundai. They're testing the Ioniq 5s. And let's not forget, Hyundai also has another autonomous driving division called 42 Dot that uses camera and radar, but no LiDAR. And then they've got the relationship with Waymo. Hyundai seems to have their hands on a lot of pies, and I'll use your partner has this great term, arms dealer, to discover the media companies that want to sell content. Does Hyundai want to be, as your partner Rich Greenfield says, an arms dealer for autonomy?
I mean, Hyundai, the name keeps popping up. I mean, it used to be 2 years ago, we talked about Toyota and all their partnerships, May Mobility and this, that, and, they had their relationship with Aurora. Obviously that press release with Waymo, but Hyundai is the name. Hyundai is the autonomy, the autonomy player. And I don't know, maybe you're getting enough Hyundais, those Ioniq 6, and you decide to buy one for yourself for your personal ownership. Good advertising, for their car.
Good advertising, great engineering. Now, what do we need to look for in the market next week?
We didn't talk really about Tesla once, so I think it's time for Tesla to give us something to talk about next week. There's been some back and forth in terms of, people getting some Robotaxi rides over the past week. So let's get some evidence of them adding cars and maybe getting some of those cyber cabs, unleashed in Austin. Maybe not this week on the cyber cabs, but at least start to drive some of the volume on the Model Ys in Austin. That's obviously something to keep an eye on.
Well, we'll be watching the data and analyzing the markets each and every week. The future is bright. The future of time is the future of scaling. Walt, until next week.